My favorite planner is the Ink and Bolt planner, and I order one for myself every year. And when I get to the end of the year, I have to decide what I'm going to do with the planner. The paper is so beautiful and the binding is lovely, and I don't want to throw it away. So I have been turning these into art journals. This one is dedicated to a series of archetypes or images, ideas, prayers, meditations that interest me. And so I've been working my way through this one with those kinds of themes in mind. And this is one I started after an Enneagram retreat weekend, and I'm thinking of this more as a soul journal, exploring emotion, exploring feeling, exploring some of the difficulties in my life and some of the ways in which those have been transformed over time. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about how I make these. For starters, I usually use some heavy gesso, and then I will print some textures into the gesso using household items. And when I do that, of course, I end up with thickness that's more than the original pages. And so I'll have to make sure that the whole thing does not become too thick and can't close. So I'm going to remove some pages. So in this book, if you look carefully, you can find the gatherings or the collections of folded pages or folded leaves that have resulted in the little booklets that are sewn together to make the entire book. And I think I have the center of a gathering there, so let's check it. So now that I've found the stitch center, that's where I can begin to remove pages. And I'm just gonna kind of anchor it and pull those out carefully without tearing the thread. By doing this, I'm just reducing the overall size of the book so that as I go along, I don't make it too thick. Now I'm going to show you how I ready the pages for some application of ink and gesso and other things. This is the gel medium that I like to use, is matte gel. You can also find it in a glossy finish, but this goes between the pages, so you're not really going to see it. The matte gel, or whatever kind of gel medium, can be applied with a palette knife or a brush. I prefer a palette knife because it's easier and faster, and I'm not a terribly patient person about things like this. And so I'll just spread it on, kind of like icing on a cake, and be sure to get it everywhere on the page, up to the edges. And so I also don't have to worry about getting it completely smooth. There are people I admire in the art world who do a beautiful job of this and make it beautifully smooth. I'm not one of those people. I just like to live with what I've got. And so once I've done that, I simply close the book. And I'm going to press down on it to make sure that the page is glued together. And now I've got this. And if I wanted to, I could use a discarded credit card or something to kind of smooth it out, but honestly, I'm not too worried about that. So we'll let that dry, and then we'll get to the next stage. As you can see here, the pages that I put together have now dried, and so what I have is nice and flexible. Gel medium is actually a polymer, and so it is flexible. When I glue with that, as opposed to something like Elmer's glue or a water-based glue, I actually end up with something that is flexible and not crispy. Next, we'll talk about how to use some household objects and gesso to establish a background in your art journal. You'll find that gesso comes in different weights, from heavy to light to even liquid, and I happen to really love this super heavy gesso, although you could use any sort of medium to heavy gesso. The super heavy looks like this. It's really thick and pasty. So I have put some of my gesso on the page, and just like I did with the gel medium, I'm just going to try to make a nice smooth-ish layer. But again, I am not a perfectionist. perfectionist where this is concerned. I'm a perfectionist in other areas of my life, but not with art. So I don't worry about the texture. In fact, I like the texture to a certain extent. We will look in a minute about how to create more texture using some items that I'll show you. So I've got a little too much on this page, so I'm going to kind of scrape it up and put it over on this page. And really, I'm just trying to get full coverage, more or less. I might see a number or a word here or there that I'd like to let show through, and that can be fun too. So I noticed the word March, I kind of like that. Might keep that there where I can kind of see it a little bit. There was the number 24, might be fun to include. Who knows why, right? Exploring the page to see what might show through the veil of this gesso. So I'm fairly content with that coverage. It's kind of thick there in the middle. The center parts are always a little bit tricky. So I just do my best to kind of smooth it out, and then I don't worry about it. As it dries, it will reduce in thickness somewhat. Okay, so I just got rid of my number 24. I want to keep the 24. I just think that might be fun to see later on. I'm getting too precious with it. All right. Okay, the next thing is the household objects I mentioned, and one of them is just this coffee cup holder from my favorite coffee place, and I'm just going to press that down into the gesso and then pull it up, and I get this nice ridged texture that you can kind of see there. And I might do that in a couple of places, but I'm going to do a little bit of extra texture on this page so that you can see all of the options. I also have bubble wrap in multiple sizes. So I have this little tiny size, which makes kind of a subtle small pattern. So I just press that down into the gesso and I peel it up. And I love that. I love that a lot. And I'm a big believer in repeating patterns to create some consistency. So you can see how those patterns go together. And I also have some really large bubble wrap. You can see where I've already used it before. So I'm going to be a little bit sparing with it, but I'm going to put it on the edge of this page and here on the bottom of this. And so, as you see, I've gone over some of that coffee cup holder with the large bubble wrap, and it doesn't make like a perfect round impression. It sort of makes these squishy places. And I have an in-between bubble wrap just to carry this to its logical extreme. So just to try a little bit of that, I'm going to stick it in the corner there, and maybe a little bit there. So maybe a tiny bit right there. More texture. And finally, another thing that adds nice texture is this gauze. So this is actually medical gauze from the drugstore. And I'll just lay it over and use my palette knife to kind of press it in so I don't get fingerprints in my gesso. And peel that up, and now I have this kind of interesting gauzy business. Another favorite of mine is paper toweling, and that will make some interesting little indentations and things like that. So again, this particular gesso is heavy and kind of gooey, so even though I've spread it on fairly thin, the textures go in with a fairly deep impression. If you use a thinner type gesso, you'll get a different result, but that's interesting and fun to play around with and discover the kind of gesso you like best. So this will dry overnight, and then we'll be ready for the next step.